come to these questions. And I think what I'd like to ask you to do is to, aside from whatever questions you may want to pose to the group, I would like to ask you very broadly some descriptive and interpretive questions, 4 of them. What is going on? Why is it going on? What should be going on? And what are some recommended steps or strategies for dealing with all of that? So what's going on? Why is it going on? What is going on? Why is it going on? What should be going on? And finally, what are some recommended next steps? You can talk directly about the film, the content, the context around the film, your own text-to-text connections, however you want to come at it. And I would ask you just to think about some of what we would call the rules of group process, just to make life a little bit easier for our communication, because after all, we're a large group and we have to manage ourselves. So if we can perhaps share these understandings, they're very basic. It's almost like the best, all the things I needed in life I learned in kindergarten. It's like, but just a reminder, if we can come together as a group, please. Let's all come together as a group, please. Thank you. So the guidelines to group process are that the whole group sits in a circle or an oval, we've approximated that. That everyone participates. Now participation has many levels, right? So it doesn't mean that you must speak, right? But we want to engage, right? Whether you're listening or processing, but we want everyone's participation, everyone's shared focus as a group. No one dominates, right? And all of this can be highly, engaging for all of us, and no one interrupts. So just try to manage that. These are our standard rules of group process that I've used in a million workshops. Speak loudly and clearly to the whole group, especially you may be far away and you might have to be theatrical and project your voice. Okay, and remember that the conversation involves the whole group. It is not a debate between 2 or 3 people. And also at the same time, please try not to have sidebars. Because it's very easy to get very excited. Oh, this reminds me of what we read, but no one else is engaged in that. So try not to have sidebars, and at the same time, try not to interrupt. So that we can all benefit from your thoughts. We use this red herring, especially when I did this for high school students, that everyone shows respect. That's kind of a red herring, And then feel free to question. As I say, we're playing tennis with the nets down. There are no rules. Your own questions. And feel free to seek clarification. Feel free to ask someone to clarify if you need to. And then feel free to build on the conversation. Let's keep the text, though, in this case it's visual text, very much in mind. Okay? Is that all right? Are these okay agreements? Okay, excellent. So let's get started with those. Oh, and I'm so glad you did that thing. The other thing is that we're asking you not to raise hands. That no one raises hands, so that you have the benefit of reading the body language of one another. And this keeps everyone attentive too. And it really does work quite brilliantly. So just to remind you a few of the prompts. What is going on? Why is it going on? Places over there. What should be going on? And how might we respond? You don't have to answer to, you're being very egalitarian, but just place it on yours, not that it takes this. How might we respond, right? That's nice. And this doesn't mean you have to answer these prompts. I've just placed them for everyone's edification, okay? All right, so feel free, anyone jump in and start. I'll be a fly on the wall. And we'll have this conversation for about 20, 25 minutes.
I believe that for everyone, your experiences or values created a lens in which you initially saw the movie. And so in my experience as an African American male, the depiction of the bad guy, although he's justifiably the bad guy, there was no balance. And then it became a distraction to the very human story of how somebody would feel if their child was kidnapped. I found myself thinking that I was just anti-Semitic. In my limited experience, the Semitic family appeared to me to be Northern African. And so I didn't initially see that as a Jewish family. Right? And so then I kind of saw it as violence on Africans on another group of Africans. So some of the dialogue helped in the movie that helped me process, okay, this Jewish person was targeted because he was a Jew, perhaps based on the assumption that he would have some money. And so I guess from my African American male experience, the kidnapper, the Django guy, I felt that it's in a form they were promoting or understanding of Semitic culture, that in that case it may have relied on the stereotype of another culture. And so this vulgar African who's not in control of his emotion is a very narrow depiction. Now, it was my first time ever hearing of the story and being familiar with it. So just on the images that I saw, and coming from an environment where African American males or black males are depicted in narrow terms, it initially made me feel like, okay, these narrow depictions exist worldwide. And it became, I had to work through that barrier for the humanity in the story.
If I may jump into it, sometimes I have a feeling that destroying certain type of debates, so I would probably poison the bride during the wedding night, but for me, honestly speaking, and we discussed it with in our small Central European circle, I had a bad feeling that this film was not so much about anti-Semitism as I expected. It was definitely about anti-Semitic stereotypes, exactly what you said, that the guy was picked up by these bad guys precisely because he was Jewish. It was definitely about non-sensitivity of police towards certain issues. Honestly speaking, from the position of Czech, Slovak, or Polish experience, I would love to see such a nice working police in some countries. I mean, they were not sensitive, but still they were, hardworking, although very. And then actually there was even a protest somewhere at the end where various people from Paris took part protesting against emergence of anti-Semitic sentiments rather than anti-Semitism. So I wonder whether this was really about anti-Semitism. I know that I'm devil's advocate here, but I would be really curious about your opinion.
I think we're not supposed to raise our hands. I think I had a little problem initially pinpointing that it was anti-Semitism until it hit me that who am I to define anti-Semitism? If the son was picked up because he was Jewish and they thought all Jews have money, that's anti-Semitism all the way. It doesn't have to be genocidal libel against Jews to be anti-Semitism.
No doubt.
So I think, and I had to think about that before I decided that yes, this was about anti-Semitism. First I thought it was some rogue people who wanted money, and hey, we heard Jews have money, let's kidnap the Jew. But it's still anti-Semitism, no matter how we cut it, that's anti-Semitism.
Sure, prayer, Muslim prayer.
Oh,
it's more notion of Muslim crime associated with the Muslims or Islamists. Prayer and primarily some details, but not more. But nevertheless, it's clear one side is Islamist.
It struck me as,
I don't, that's not how I interpreted it. I see.
Yeah, but I mean, there's some details very obvious.
No, it is an anti-Semitic event. It is exactly as you described. There's anti-Semitic attitudes. Whether they're anti-Semites, the other anti-Semites, we can debate, that's another. But the use of the use of the radio is intended to intimidate. It's not intended to spread jihadistic ideas. It's intended to intimidate. Just like putting a noose on a college campus is intended to intimidate black students, or putting a swastika is intended to intimidate. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the person doing it even fully understands the implications of what they're doing. That's not an excuse. That's just in terms of the film. So I think part of the problem is this film a persuasive film outside of France? Because in France, everything is understandable. I was saying to David before that there are lots of reasons I can't use the film, but one of them, in the U.S. context, to read the word big black barbarian has a particular context. You can't erase it. You can't explain it. But in French, it was intended to be a description. And we know it's intended to be a description, not that they're not racist French, but we know it's a description because the barbarians as a group was understood to be a group of people from the banlieue made up of delinquents, psychopaths, sociopaths. And some were North African and some were Eastern European. And, you know, just about every bad movie, the bad gangsters are all those Eastern European, African, North Africans.
This is a biographical movie. It's based on a true story. If they had changed Fufana and made him a white man or an Asian man, that would be historically inaccurate.
Well, that's what I'm saying, that it works for France and the
that would
details.
have made it a fictional movie. So I think it was, I was relatively accurate from what I learned of the events themselves and what happened, and when I saw the movie, it matched up pretty well. I would have liked to have seen a little bit more of Fufana's background to understand just how much Islam played in. I mean, there were a lot of loose ends, I agree, but if we were to start changing the profiles of the people in the movie, then we're getting into Hollywood type
Yeah,
movies.
but I don't think that that's the suggestion. That's what I say, it works for France.
there's a piece of this thing that really upsets me, I think, beyond those issues. I don't disagree with it. And that is that, I guess the chief of police versus the guys just below him. It was obviously a distinction. The chief of police did not, under any circumstances, want to label something that was obvious to, at least to us, certainly, and I knew about the case before, that was clearly anti-Semitism. And his second or third in command said, or the person on the case said, it is. And he said, no, it isn't. I don't want it. Don't do it. It's criminal. And that's obviously an effort by authorities not to get involved or to try to avoid, under all circumstances, calling, you know, it's, what is it, if it smells like a fish and it looks like a fish, then it must be a fish. And this was clearly anti-Semitism, and it was clearly based on the religion. The same way he would not have acted, I believe, wrong, I don't know if it's that well, had the victim been an African, or if it had been a gay person. I think in that situation they would have been much more quick to label it what it was as a racial crime or a clear expression. And I think when it comes to Jews or when it comes to anti-Semitism, the higher up the authorities are, the less willing they are to call it. And I found there was a strength in the younger officer who wanted to do the right thing. And yet, you're not going to disregard or disobey his superior. He was pretty upset.
Aren't we kind of making an assumption, though, that if they didn't draw our conclusion that somehow or another they made a mistake? You're talking about people who were in law enforcement, and you're talking about a conclusion that is antithetical to gathering the evidence and material in order to prosecute or investigate a case. So by changing terminology to suggesting that it was an anti-Semitic act, unless there's a legal component that suggests that the procedure for the investigation is going to change because the definition of crime has been altered, then anything that distracts from the ability to focus in on the materials that allow you to effectively prosecute and investigate is going to inhibit your ability to proceed. So it could very easily be that the police simply said, we can't engage in that kind of exchange because it doesn't contribute to the investigation. It doesn't get us one step closer to saving this person. It's a sociological analysis, not a legal one.
I don't want to respond to that.
I think that anti-Semitism or all the political aspects in these movies are secondary. So the main purpose was to create a thriller, and this was anti-Semitism, racism is not so. Of course, this movie is made up of many cliches. Of course, there is a bad black guy, etc., but it's secondary. All these political anti-Semitic aspects are secondary. It's like I think it was in the 50s. People made use of Holocaust material to create pornography magazines. So they make use of this story of Ilan Halimi, but I didn't get the impression that the purpose or that this movie really managed to convey the political aspects, the anti-Semitic aspects of this story.
I have a question for Jeff Dilson. I wonder as academics, maybe we're just putting too much weight on something that can't bear it. I have a friend who I think makes movies for the same Menashe because he does it. I don't watch his movies very much, but in my experience, he spends all his time trying to raise money. That's what you do if you want to make a movie here. You're preoccupied with money.
Yes.
And movies are designed to make money. That's what you need to do. Otherwise, you can't be a movie maker.
Yes, you can be independent.
Well, here's what I was thinking of it though, it's like this why there once was a time when academics held movies in contempt, and it took a lot of work to stop having people show contempt for popular culture. But then so much of that effort is made that we forget that popular culture is only that, and it can't show many things. Like I saw two other what I thought were good movies on the Holocaust, one, the Pianist and the Son of Saul, and in both of them, the violence was highly stylized. It wasn't real violence. It was like when the wounds of the man in the movie, they weren't real wounds, etc. And the real question is, shouldn't we or not the real question, but a question I was thinking probably from it is, maybe academics should be asking people not to pay close attention to movies. That movies are what they are. They are movies, and that we have to steer them more to reading books and to thinking really about what violence is really like, and movies just can't show that.
I disagree. So I agree with what with your description of this movie, right? But some of my favorite movie makers just had no money. They died poor. Just think about Tarkovsky, so it's or Parajanov, right? So yes, this is a this is a thriller and not the best thriller I saw in my life. And it makes use of this event to make it entertaining.
But that's kind of not fair to Alexander.
I disagree with this opinion because I think that it was a great idea of educators in the fans to take real story and to talk in the voice of the cinema to the fans public. So it was recognizable fact, it was recognizable story, and the story which had continuation. So now the understanding of the relationship and so on. So I think that it's now a great idea to talk about the problems in the absolutely new way, which is impressible for the young generation and it's impressible for the middle generation. So I think that it's not only the make of money, it's not only the such kind of game in the cinematography, but it's in reality to have some steps in the education, and it's more formal education. So it's the best things in this movie.
Just one comment about the movie, which is particular. It was not a movie aimed at making money. This was a movie actually that was supported by the Foundation for the Memorial of the Shoah, which is a foundation that got all of the money that was left over after the Shoah from the murdered Jews. And it promotes cultural things, and now it's working around fighting anti-Semitism. So I don't really think that that was the main motive. The other thing is, in terms of the accuracy, if you think it was exaggerated, point out specific moments in the movie that you think were not accurate and that don't parallel with the real life story. I was living in France at the time. I followed the story very closely. I mean, a movie is never perfectly accurate. It's like a painting. It's still a depiction or a caricature. There might have been points that were exaggerated for a dramatic extent, but I thought there were some loose ends, but ultimately they did a pretty good job of following the timeline and depicting. I mean, they actually used the real, imagine they used in this movie the actual people who experienced this event. Elan Halimi's mother played herself in the movie.
Okay.
That's very unique.
But I want maybe
Yeah, she
to
was, yes.
No, this is an actress.
Okay, I thought she actually played,
She looked like a mother, like the real.
Everybody looks
Cross
like
out
the
the
real
last
people
one.
who go to the newspaper images. But I think that I'm sorry to interrupt, just to underline two things, because I think it keeps getting lost in this discussion. One is, this is a French movie for a French audience. It is exactly what is in the newspaper. I stopped, the first time I watched it, I had to stop to look up, because I couldn't believe that there was this black person. Well, there was, and so was everybody else, and the psychologist is a real jackass, excuse my French. So that is true, but again, it's not, is this accurate or not, could it be better, that's not the point. The point is, what can those who are not French get from this film? We're here not just to talk about politics, but to talk about what do we do in a classroom? How do we educate people? That's one. And the second, just to put it in, because we need it as a perspective, Alexander Arcadi is a specific filmmaker, and he makes films which draw on Jewish experiences from the films that are not subtitled, like the Grand Pardon, for those of you who know, those who have been in Israel, it was called, in Hebrew, it was called The Jewish Godfather, to his most recent, not successful film, on sort of autobiographical, on Jews in Algeria. His films don't work outside of France, except as curiosities. So I just think that we do need to remember that.
I think, I didn't see all the movie, but I thought to compare it to another movie that I used to show in my classes, it's the Battle of Onagio. And this is a story also about Islamophobia and fascism and violence, but it's so much more subtle and much more artistic than this movie. This movie, I don't know, it's like, I don't know what is the added value to show it to students in class. If you see the movie, the Battle of Onagio, it's a specific event, yet it's universal. Everybody got some kind of, not this kind of movie like the story of Ilan Khalili, but other horrific movies that you can use as a text in your class, but not this kind.
That's a masterpiece.
Yeah.
You're talking about a masterpiece.
Yes.
Right. It's like seeing the Mona Lisa.
Yeah, but still, young
Let's,
children don't
let's
know
remember
this
the,
is
first,
showing them.
let's remember the rules of group process. This is one thing as a facilitator, just occasionally jump up like a Jack in the Box, so just to remind people of the rules of group process. One person speaking at a time. Also remember that the whole group is present, so people have different personalities in terms of their ability to jump into the conversation. So now I'm going to ask you just to take it up a level in terms of being very much aware of those around you who may wish to contribute. Okay? And so let's just continue for like another 5 to 10 minutes.
For me, I think it's a very good movie to show to the students, usually Chinese students, to teach them the anti-Semitism. So this movie, from that perspective, I think it's anti-Semitic events here in the movie because there was 3 sentences in the movie I remember. First, Ilan was chosen because Jewish. Second, Jewish is rich. The third, even the family is poor, the Jewish community will pay the money. So every semester when I meet face-to-face with over 100 students on my class, I always ask them one question. When people mention the Jews, what's the first word came to your mind? Guess what? Rich. Second, talented. Third, Karl Marx.
Nose.
So rich is the very important phrase. Karl Marx.
Karl Marx.
So I always tell my students, rich, not all the Jewish people is rich. Rich is also a stereotype to all Jewish people. So I think this movie for me is very useful to showing on the class to teach them about this question. And I just wonder, at the end of the movie, the police didn't acknowledge this event is anti-Semitic. I have a question. When the mother told the police, mentioned that her son was chosen because his Jewish identity, was the police realized at that moment? If they realized at that moment, will there be different in the when they dealing with the case? That's my question. Just wonder this. They didn't acknowledge, but do they know when the mother told them her son was chosen because of Jewish identity? At that moment, the police realized that. What do you say?
Well, if I may jump into it, France is a country which is not recognizing minorities on its territory. If it would be knocking on the door of the European Union these days, they would be kicked out, basically not admitted, they are not fulfilling elementary Copenhagen criteria in this respect. So the reluctance to admit that this was anti-Semitic, should be viewed also in this respect. We have no minorities on this territory. We have just three sorts of people. French, who were born in France, French born outside of the country, and foreigners. No Jews, no Italians, whoever, you can add whoever's there. So that's the first thing. The second, and this is the experience of our countries in the century of the reluctance to admit that some attack was racist, anti-Semitic, whatever, is also the fear on the side of police that once they will admit it, they will have problems. It will go into statistics, it will be served again and again. So they are trying to convince all involved people that this was not really racist. So even if there is in Slovakia somebody screaming on a Roma person, you stinky gypsy, they are trying to put it into some artificial context and convince people, this is not racist because we are of the same race. We are of the Indo-European race, Roma and we Slovaks. So this is definitely not racist. And you are staring at it like, okay, so when it's not popular, they are stinky gypsies, and when suddenly, it becomes dangerous, we are one race. So hey, so again, that's another topic. But you raised a good point. Because for me, and I'm thinking about my students, to show this, and again, let me be provocative. I saw, of course, the anti-Semitism there very clearly. But to show it to my students, they would say something like this. Okay, this is really worrying. Because if this is happening in countries such as France, where Jews were living unnoticed, so to say, for so many decades, this is really worrying, because we wouldn't be surprised in our country, of course, which is responsible for Holocaust and Slovakia was mentioned in Wannsee conference as a perfectly cooperating country. I think if this is happening in France, it's worrying. But at the same time, what they would say? But on the other hand, police was functioning well. There was a massive protest at the end of the movie. France is a great country. Not like here in Slovakia. No, I'm serious, I'm provocative here, but it has, so for me, it's really questionable how much this might be understood outside of France. Is that exactly what you
Yes,
said?
exactly.
I have another question.
Sorry?
In the light of recent events.
Let's remember the rules of group process. I think, so you can jump on in with your question.
The question is inspired by Gilbert's comment, is that I guess the actual kidnapping was like an overt anti-Semitic act. But when you question the police officer, it made me think, was that an attempt to depict that anti-Semitic behaviors are ingrained within the culture? And so they exist below the surface and they're almost normal practice.
I would argue that. But I don't have, I mean, just the nature of bureaucracy, the nature of higher up bureaucracy, tends to want to make everything look nice and good. And criminality versus, say, racism or sexism or homophobia or whatever it is, it's just a crime.
So in ignoring the ingrained anti-Semitic behavior of the cop, that actually could contribute to the delay, which eventually led to the death. Whether acknowledging that they have these internal biases, they acknowledge it earlier, maybe it helps them see the crime for what it is and act sooner or act in a more appropriate way. I guess, I don't know if appropriate is the right word. Going back to David's comment about, let's putting our assumptions and values on the crime or on the process. I guess in the African American context, being African American is always a part of it. And so, that, as this experience is, a new learning process for me is that they would attempt to be even-handed. That it's just a new phenomenon. I'm not saying it was right, wrong, or effective, but in America, in my context, the fact that I'm black is the first thing that they're going to say. And then they'll use that as reason to justify whatever happened because I'm black. And so in that case, as someone who has been marginalized, to develop the view that other people have these experiences in a different type of context is just disappointing.
It's kind of different. That's interesting because we're in a context in which we're specifically addressing anti-Semitism, period. We could be in a different context in which we're discussing marginalized people. And I don't remember the name, I'm sorry, of there's a film by a Chinese director who made a lot of films and became well known, and then he made this controversial film that was released to the West. And one of the scenes is the murder of a Chinese, he's not Han, he's from a different group. And I'll think of the name, if you don't think of the name, I'll think of it after we're over and I'll write it down. But there are several films that have been made about people who are marginalized in their countries, and they are killed or harassed, and nobody admits to the fact that it is a crime, that it is a racist crime. And this week, I don't have the name, but this last week, there's not only been the slaughtering of the priest in the Catholic Church, but there's a black person who was killed in police custody in France. It has not really been headline news, but it's been in the news nonstop. And part of the argument is being drawn from Black Lives Matter in the United States. In other words, it's being understood through the lens of French racism and with the vocabulary and the imagery and iconography from the United States that's allowed a vocabulary that didn't exist before. So in the context of France, in the context of Europe, we've got all these examples of minority, and I use the word not in the US sense, but literally in the American sense, populations, the Roma you reminded, but also those who are from North Africa, from the Maghreb, who are not Jewish, in the Banlieue. In 2000, what was it, 2005, you have the explosion, and you have a whole discussion with Bernard-Henri Lévy saying, this is racism. It's very different from what he said in May, which is on YouTube, about Europe is now in crisis and we better all pack our bags and go. But so there's so many complex issues that are raised that are not the film but that are evoked by the film in a particular context of discussions of racism.
Just jump in. Don't raise your hand, just jump in.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, you are absolutely right. I just wanted to say that in 2005 happened a bandit of these riots, and 2 Arabic kids were killed from the police. And this even happened in 2006. Could be or should be a revenge for that. And the police didn't do anything. I mean, in Hungary it's a hate crime. And we have to take into consideration that it is hate crime. And the hate crime is in the Hungarian legislation. But the police have to investigate more. There's a lot to do with this events, if something hate crime is. And as you mentioned in Slovakia, then police officers said, no, it is not hate crime, it's just a criminal, it's just a simple criminal. And
Punishment is double.
yeah, yes. And they have a lot to do with this hate crime events. And that's why they don't want to do that, especially against the Roma people. In Hungary there was a serious crime against the Roma, and there is also a film, this Judgment in Hungary, this film from Esther, I forgot her name. This film won a lot of awards everywhere in Europe and also in the US. So it's Lester's Judgment in Hungary. So it's about the trial of these killers. They killed about six persons and injured many of them, and this is about this trial. So I think that this film is kind of hate crime, I think, and the kidnappers wanted to humiliate all the Jewish society, just to show. It was not about the money, I think. They wanted to torture this young guy and at the end communicate him. Yeah.
All right, thank you, everyone, for participating in the group process discussion. Just one last comment. It looked like you were just about to.
I wanted to underscore that the focus that you said, for example, is the core of this sample. So the anti-Semitism is something very particular. So we know that there are a lot of type of racism, a lot of type of hate crimes, but the anti-Semitism in this case, the trailer was very, very good, because if in Paris, a democratic country with a very good police, can happen this type of crime, so one Jew cannot be sure in the world, never. So maybe in Israel. So this is with this type of story, this is the consequence. And the anti-Semitism is something very particular. There is no reason to be rich for this family, but if Jew, so we can take money and kill him, and we will have the support of all the others.
Thank you everybody for participating in the group process discussion. So that might be one way. I mean, very often, even if you're teaching a lecture, you might decide one day or 1 week to get into some kind of configuration and provide. And we're going to give you a printed copy of all the protocols that I share with you before you leave. So you get the protocols for this and about 5 others, right? So you'll have them really electronically and in some instances by paper from us. You get it, okay? We'll try to save some trees, so a lot will probably be electronic, but we will hand out some paper to you as well, okay? So you will have the protocol, so not to worry. If you wanted to jot things down, that's fine, but just know that we will have a formulaic protocol provided to you, okay? So now that, and you notice, the low tech, notice I did what, statement, I think you were an elementary school principal at one point. Elementary school teachers very often do this kind of, what they used to call it stick and ball, lettering, ball and stick for everything. But just something colorful, engaging. Eric Jensen talks about what the brain likes, color. It likes novelty, right? These are the arguments that are made very often in educational psychology. So just attending to that. So we don't always have to be high tech. We can sometimes be low tech and use that to be engaging. All right, so let me ask you also, if you might just reflect now on the process, and let's do a little bit of a formative, I mean, in a sense, this is a formative and a summative assessment. We're going to ask you in a summary way to assess how you think you did as an individual with relationship to the rules of group process, and how you feel that the group did with relationship to the rules of group process. And it's not personal at all. It's not calling out anyone saying, oh, he did this or she did that. But you can report on yourself, saying like, well, I felt like I was engaged, or even though I didn't speak, I was engaged, or I spoke too little, I spoke not enough, I was interested, I got cut off, I interrupted. Whatever is your own personal self-assessment, right? It's not about judgment, but just about awareness. So I'm going to ask you to do a self-assessment and an assessment of the group, right? But we're not doing assessment about others at the table, right? You're telling yourself, but not on others. But you can't tell on the group. You say, I think we were a lousy group, or I think we were a great group, or whatever, right? So you can report on the group. So I'm going to ask you just for a moment, just to think about what the rules of group process were. The whole group sits in a circle or oval, everyone participates, no one dominates, no one interrupts, speak loudly and clearly to the whole group. Remember that the conversation involves the whole group. It is not a debate between two or others. There are no sidebars. Refer to the text. Everyone shows respect, and I didn't write here, but we will have it in the written protocol. No one raised his hands. And feel free to question, seek clarification, and to build. Okay, so I'm going to ask you just to take a moment and think about that. And then, using the rules of group process, just speak for about 5 minutes. Let's speak about 5 minutes about doing a little bit of a summative assessment. It's formative in the sense that we're going to return to this process again before the week is out. That is, we're going to do at least one other group process discussion. So it is formative because we're checking in to see where we are before we get somewhere else. Okay? So it's both summative and formative. So I'm going to ask you to just reflect for just a minute or two, and then let's have you report out. So just think for a minute or two, and then I'm going to have you just turn and talk to the person next to you about your report. And then we can just maybe get a few examples. Right? So think for a minute, and then we'll have you turn and talk about your self-assessment and group assessment. I wish I had more time. Okay, great. All right, why don't we come back together, group? Let's have group process. Thank you, group. Thank you. We're coming back together. Thank you. Thank you, group. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. We've got the group process back in place. Oh, by the way, when one calls a group-to-group process, it's really very interesting if we don't look at any one person. Like, if one person is doing it, that's like group process, and to the person who is violating group process, right? We want to keep a safe space, which is what Kane and Kelly talk about in their wonderful book, Making Connections about the brain, how the brain works. And the theory is that when one is engaged in fear, one actually begins not to operate in the frontal lobe, but in the reptilian brain. It's fight or flight, but it's not higher level thinking. So the theory, at least which I embrace, and which I am advocating through our exploration of metacognition, constructivism, and other approaches to teaching and learning, is that we want to try to create as fearless a classroom as possible. And that's what these strategies attempt to do. Okay, but at the same time, they attempt to engage. So it doesn't mean there aren't rules. There's ordered chaos. So anybody want to share anything that you either said or that you heard? And again, you can use the rules of group process to report out, so you don't have to raise your hand. You can just call out, be sensitive to who's around you, be aware of the psycholinguistics, and just jump in and share. Anything that you think might be edifying to the group. Something that you either said or that you heard with regard to your self-assessment or group assessment. Anybody, just jump in.
It's always interesting to me to see group dynamics at work. So as a young child, I was very painfully shy. And you get over that fast when you're a student teacher and start studying abroad. And so I was sharing that, I had different ideas. And you're sort of waiting for the appropriate moment to jump in. But conversations are fluid and they move quickly, and then you wonder whether your point is still relevant. And so I said, well, my personality is sort of, if I'm able to work through the issue and it makes sense and I reach some resolution in my own mind, I don't necessarily feel compelled to share that because I don't know that it's almost a personal gratification. While there are maybe other personality types in any group that feel compelled to advance dialogue, or let's face it, we're all in academics. We all have colleagues who like just simply to open their mouths and hear their own voice. The point, I sort of lost my train of thought.
Well, you were talking about being shy.
I was thinking about, as we're all educators, how might we, though I'm not a shy individual anymore, certainly could have benefited in my younger years from teachers who found ways creatively to draw out my thoughts and to value my perspectives. And so, those of us who were quiet, we could find ways to go out on limbs and express ourselves in alternative ways, perhaps. But as educators, I think it behooves us to think of ways to be more inclusive in our classroom, and particularly when talking about very sensitive, very controversial topics that some may find. I introduced myself last night. I said I love to teach controversial topics, but I'm not at all a lecturer. I'm a seminarist, and so it's 50-50. The students need to feel comfortable to share, and that's easy to do if you're learning French vocabulary. But when you're talking about human trafficking in a seminar on prostitution, that's quite a different classroom environment. Now I've spoken a lot.
Great, and we'll have you speak. And one of the things that I attempted to do, just to make it conscious for you, if you didn't notice, was to create opportunities for everyone to talk, so that I would pepper it with a turn and talk. Well, at least the person is going to have one person that he or she is talking to and listening to, right? So that's one way in which we can get whole group involvement, even if you have someone who just couldn't get it out, or someone who couldn't bring herself or himself out. Okay?
I thought the process, although excellent, left those who don't know how to jump in at the right moment out. There was a book out some time ago I read called Quiet. I think it was called Quiet. And it was about how the world is missing out on people who are quiet. And they're not being engaged or invited to the table as easily. So I attended this, I actually was at the Department of Education in Washington, was participating in rewriting the Higher Education Act of 1962. And we sat at a table like this, and if everyone had their name like this, and if you wanted to speak, you did this. And there was a moderator who would keep track of who put their card up first. And that way everyone had a chance to talk.
Yeah, yes, and well, of course, and that sounds wonderful. And it can be one of many strategies, right? A couple of things I would like to add, though, would be that we are also, with students, helping to push them out of their comfort zone, and we're skill building. So it's sometimes in life, I mean, the person's not going to be standing next to you when you have to, you know, say something to the clerk or the attendant at the airport when your flight is about to leave, which was my situation. I had to say, hey, my flight's about to leave, I'm sorry, but, right? So being able to use that energy and knowing to develop that life skill to do that assertiveness is also important.
I understand, and you're 100% correct. Being a student and living in a dorm, I put myself in the student mode, so I'm living my life.
And this is one of but this is one of very many strategies, and this is great. I mean, actually I could guide you through literally 100 different literacy strategies. We're only going to touch on 5, but you know, but yeah. There's someone else who's going to share, or
An alternative vision. This is obviously one model where it appears that everybody has a few words they can contribute. And unfortunately for me, that creates a lot of unfinished, a lot of incoherent ideas that are floating about, and they're never given a chance to mature. So the counter model that I also find works is when you have a couple of very astute students who hold diametrically opposed positions, and the rest of the crowd gets to watch the fight. But what they learn is the debate process, and so long as it's done in a civil manner, and so long as both sides understand the nature of the debate, and with time, that kind of active, almost unfettered, with restraint of course, engagement will spark even the quiet students, first to reflection, and then down the road, you'll get them to realize that it's okay to have an opinion. And they will begin to look at let's call it the morality of their peers, is a little bit more of a model. And I find that works too. But it's over the long haul. It can never be just a single classroom setting. It's got to be a whole semester long. And then obviously, not just completely unfettered.
It's just interesting. Just I don't want to keep commenting on it. I think were you going to make a comment? Or? No, yes, I thought you had before you were.
I didn't know about that, but I can say something. No, what always amazed me in such a kind of event that because I'm from Prague, I'm applying this right on being on Central Europe, and it's very funny to observe the point that like people from West, what we consider West, are much more open to communicate, much more sharing. And more east you go, more people are closed and they are afraid to even like raise any question. This is just like a European experience, I don't know. And if you notice who didn't talk here, it was me. It was
we're going to report on yourself. You're going to report on yourself, not others.
It's very interesting. Also, Sharon.
It's not true because Czechia raised there. Yeah, eastwards.
But along these, are you finished?
Yes.
Along these lines, I just wanted to say that, I mean, I always feel like I want to contribute, but I get so much out of hearing other people when they come from elsewhere, especially. And I wanted to say, I won't point to anyone in particular because it's a few people, but one person in particular, I thought was incredibly generous, the sharing of personal experience. And I just wanted to say thank you.
Yeah. Now you point out also something which is very helpful to us, which is, multiple intelligences, that, some people are more auditory learners, some are more visual, some are more bodily kinesthetic, So, you know, my wife has always been a varsity athlete. You know, I struggled through sports and I got there, but she was a varsity athlete. So, you know, I might bump into things around the house or still be a little bit clumsy. And there's a wonderful quote she uses, which I would just plant with you. She will laugh with me and say things like, well, you know, the axe forgets, but the tree remembers. The axe forgets, but the tree remembers. Like that has so many applications. So I'll just leave that wonderful quote with you and see what you think about that. The axe forgets, but the tree remembers.
But I'd like to add something to Marcela, that I wanted to say something, but there is so many people talking. But for me, this is also one more barrier, and this is the language, because if you would like to say something precisely, and sometimes it happens that you miss the word, and if I talk in Polish, in my own language, I have no problems with with this. When I have to say something precisely in English, sometimes I stop, because I don't know if I can express what I think exactly in the way I wanted to say it. So this is also the problem in the different method.
I'm so glad you mentioned that, because one of the things that comes out of these kinds of processes, and we kind of know this having gone through higher ed, but it's worth reminding ourselves, I think, is that one's language changes with the immersion. It's like being a fish swimming in the water. You hear this phrase, and someone else says, oh, that's a beautiful phrase. I'll phrase things that way. Or that's a new word. Oh, that's a great word. That's a great phrase. And so we very often borrow from one another. And so there's that language development, those connections, which will then help also in language development and vocabulary development.
Yes, of course, but when you talk in your own language or listen or something like that, you are less concentrated than when you listen other language. So you have to concentrate much more on understanding and talking, and so it is a bigger effort, I think.
I feel it too. I feel that there's this kind of feeling that English is the right way to speak academically, and, because we all read English mostly, you know, and we feel a little bit behind, because I think everybody will speak American. That's right. That's my first thought, you know, but yeah, I know.
Well, it's lingua franca for, I guess, for the Summer Institute.
Yeah,
but,
some, you know, native speakers.
I think we have.
But even within the United States, I've been places in the United States where I didn't understand what was being said.
Right.
Most people from the United States have experienced that.
Well, thank you. So, and then how do you think, just one or two people, how do you think the group did as a whole in terms of the dynamic? I thought it was remarkable. Yeah.
I
Yeah.
think you made a great job.
Oh, thank you. You guys did. No, it's great. You know, it's really wonderful. And it's, you know, it's hard. And I'm sure you can appreciate this. It's very hard being the facilitator, because you really so want to jump in. And but if you do jump in, it becomes more didactic, or it can seem more like there's the authority of the teacher speaking, and then that person has the superior or more powerful voice. Whereas here we aim for something egalitarian. So the person who's guiding it really facilitates and steps out and lets the process flow. It only pops in as a referee.
I just throw something back. I'm curious to hear what you said. When I used to teach an intro to politics course, and I still do when I teach American government survey course, but I don't teach it that often, I did the Socratic method, which is a different technique, obviously, totally, but the dynamics that it creates in class, especially early in a semester, is incredibly intense. But the results are phenomenal in, I would say, 85% of the cases. And I only learned that by watching the teachers who had the biggest impression on me. And I don't do it, except I don't do it in advanced classes, but I do it specifically in a class.
Yeah, the Socratic method is.
But it requires a different, it's not the mastery that you bring with us, but it's a different.
It's a more active guide. It's a more active guide, right? Yeah.
It's a tense environment, but it works.
Yes. That was one of the favorite parts I had about my undergraduate experience at Columbia. They were very big on that, on their core curriculum was Socratic. And I felt like STEAM, so you know, CC, lit, hum, or hum, all that. You feel like STEAM is coming out of your ears because it's so wonderful. Yeah, great.
He wanted to say something.
Yes.
I don't know your name. So.
Greg.
No, I was just going to say, before everybody started feeling all good about themselves. And I thought what you were going to say about quiet was, I actually felt, I thought the process was very good work, much better than I thought it was going to work. I thought everyone was sort of sinning out. But they didn't, but at the same time, I thought what you were going to say about quiet was that, if at certain points you don't need to jump right in, even though you're going to say something, and I do need moments of quiet, because it felt like people were jumping at the same time. And it could be me, and I'm surprised no one said it, so maybe it is just me, but it seemed that at least, maybe it's an understatement that the men were jumping in much less hesitantly than the women. It could have just been me observing it incorrectly. But yeah, just maybe waiting to see if anyone else is wanting to speak and sort of, maybe it's the wrong word, but sort of a self-censorship, saying, okay, I've already spoken, so I'm not going to necessarily jump in after waiting one turn, I'm going to two, but I'm going to let everybody out. And maybe the quiet thing would be, okay, quiet, this would probably, maybe it would happen in grade school, the quiet, and let someone who hasn't actually spoken thus far break the quiet.
And there's nothing wrong with quiet. Sometimes the quiet can last. You can have that kind of that pause that lasts for a long time, and it's really beautiful. And the challenge for the facilitator is not to jump in, but rather to let it carry through. Because people are processing. And that's an important part for us to consider.
Yeah, I'm curious, and this may not be the moment, but I'm curious about the classrooms that everybody teaches in. So at Grinnell, except for the sciences, I think the maximum usually would be 20, and more of our classes veer between 10 and 18. So in a seminar, you could have 15 students, and around in an oval table if you're lucky. For me, I am one of those people who call on students. Right away from the first day, I just call on students. And I say, if you don't like, some people talk a lot, I talk a lot, and some people find it very difficult to enter into a conversation. But because I'm the professor in the classroom, I can say, well, you haven't said anything. What do you think about that? Which allows that person to speak because they've been given more. So even if they're shy, at that point there's something to say. And especially if you open the door and say, you don't have to comment explicitly on what we're talking about, but what have you been thinking about?
Yes.
At the end of the semester, everybody's spoken. At the end of the day, or at least that week, 2 classes a week, everyone has spoken at least once.
So great. And so 2 things just to thank you, because you touched on 2 things which are really important and really serve as a nice segue for me. One is that every kind of literacy strategy that I share with you should be seen, I would say, as simply an additional tool in your toolkit, what you're already doing. So it's not to replace anything that you're doing. So you're doing something and it's working, then that's great. And then say, hey, this might be an added bit of novelty that I might use, or I might try out. Okay, so everything is simply to add to, not to take away from what you're doing. And secondly, that's a brilliant segue, because one of the things I want to ask each of you, what I want to do is to have you begin to, as we prepare for Wednesday, we're going to meet 2 more days, and in those days we're going to get really nuts and bolts into the professor pack, right, and into the Forstein reading, that abstract by Rigg et al., and then we are also going to take a look at the state of play with regard to your syllabi. So what I'd like to ask you to do, we'll be in the evening on Wednesday and Thursday, you'll see in our program. There are a couple things I'd like to ask you to do in preparation for that. One is to kind of build on what Katya was saying. I'd like in a moment to ask each of you just to tell us and to remind the group of your discipline, or your specialty, or your real area of strength, right? It might be something embedded within your discipline that you do, your specialization, right? Just share briefly, because we're a large group, just share with us briefly. And at the same time, I'd like to ask everybody else to listen out. Because I'd like for you to listen out to like 2 people who are doing something that may or may not be in your area. And you would, and I would like to ask you to think about that being, those being 2 people that you'd like to try to pair up with. Because I'd like to have you like in groups of 3 for looking at your syllabi and thinking together and sharing. So kind of listen, if you will, with regard to a discipline or such that might be engaging for you. And then we'll just, it will be a little messy because some people may be going in one direction or the other, but at least listen out for a few people that you think, gee, it might be good to pair up with such a person to help make my specific course even stronger as I think about an interdisciplinary or cross-disciplinary approach to my subject, which would have as a common through line contemporary global anti-Semitism. Right? So, so why don't we, since you mentioned that, Katya, why don't we just start with you and just come and wrap right around to, what is your name? David. David? I'll say and wrap up with David, okay? So if you just announce what your discipline or specialization is, what you're, especially thinking in terms of the syllabus that you've been creating. And that you might even say what the title of your syllabus is, or at least the subject. And then listen out, and let's have you, before we leave, group up in 3s, because we're going to roll up our sleeves with the professor pack. If you have it printed out already, great. If not, please try to get it printed out for Wednesday. Okay? All right. I think you might be able to print out in the college, but if not, if you have your copying machine, so we'll find some ways to work out, and we'll see what we can do. Okay? So let's start.
I already said I'm at the Liberal Arts College, so I'm in culture. I have a PhD in cultural anthropology, and it's all in there. But I am in between disciplines, so it combines philosophy, political thought, and African studies.
Okay, and so next, Elan. Yes.
What do you do?
Oh, I do philosophy.
And your specialization, or
yes, I wrote on. I have a book on Holocaust studies, on the contribution of 8 German intellectuals to the discussion of how to find a solution and the Holocaust. And, many articles on intellectual history of
King?
And I live in contemporary.
A little louder, please, if you can.
And I live in history series, especially in contemporary British history series. And I teach the students contemporary work history, and so the anti-Semitism is part of my teaching in the classroom, and so I compare to study
Great.
I'm a PhD in philosophy, and my major is anti-Semitism, Holocaust, and I do a lot of work on medieval anti-Semitism. Recently, I researched on the image of Jewish people in the medieval Christian art, caricature.
I'm just a mess. I do modern Europe, but I guess I would say the stuff I've been looking at more recently deals with the legal parameters of an occupied country and the challenges that go with war crimes, prosecution in various countries, legal contexts, and the like.
Michael Lane, and though I originally began in 19th century French poetics, I wasn't very sellable at a public institution in North Carolina. And so I made forays into French and Francophone cultural studies with special emphasis on the Caribbean and Maghrebine literatures and cultures, which led me on another path to exploring issues of self and other, a general education honor seminar that I teach that focuses on sexuality, faith, gender, and race. And of course, then developing here takes that a little bit further then, so it'll be a junior level service learning course that promotes community partnerships to get students out, to treat altruism and philanthropy as life habits. What can they do to better the communities in which they live? So it'll be a course on anti-Semitism as an overarching theme, but getting them out to commit to a cause in which they can commit and contribute through their final collegiate years.
Great. Ava?
I'm only psychologist here. I'm a social psychologist, and my main topics are social representation of history, narratives, and interpretation. So very specifically collective traumas and how to process them, and recently projects as well.
I'm Sabin, and my PhD is in education and leadership, K-12 administration. So, former elementary school, taught kindergarten, from assistant principal to church administration. I teach in an honors college which has students from all majors, and I design courses that are really primarily, I guess my expertise is in people, in terms of taking students from where they are and trying to move them where they wouldn't go on their own. It's more of nurturing than it is lecturing. So I like to see myself as the guide on the side as opposed to the sage on the stage.
I'm a student, and the area of interest is right because I am focusing on the Jewish history in the Lithuania, especially in the Learn Better Lithuania, so it means till the end of the 18th century. And my dissertation was a dissertation that was a long time ago, and it was on the resistance history. And I researched that in the anti-Judaism, the stereotyping, the different myths and resolution of the conflicts in the society. And then I started to teach. I always work with the comparison history, comparison social history on different national minorities, especially with non-Christian groups of the Lithuania, the Scaric community, so part of Jews, and Muslim Tatars, because Lithuania had old Muslim Tatars, and there's a specific group. Sometimes it is Polish problem, Belarusian problem, and Russian problem in Lithuania. What I teach quite wide spectrum of the courses. Part of them are directly with the town's history of the Learn Better Lithuania, including the Jews and as non-citizens and different minorities groups. Then I have till now I have course on the anti-Semitism, about the resolving of the conflicts. And more I teach the Jewish heritage and preservation of the Jewish heritage and visualization of the Jewish culture in contemporary Lithuania. And sometimes what the last project which I finished was on the historical Jewish family demography in the 18th century. It was based on the Jewish census in the Learn Better Lithuania. So if I wanted to know how it looks like a Jewish family, household, and their values, so
And before we get to Elite, I think this group has been on the march, so we're going to let you jump in. And then jump in, okay?
Yes, I've just finished the postdoctoral studies in my research, the cooperation between the Nazis and the Arabs in the World War II. I had some films like the Nazi propaganda spread to Arab countries.
Hold on 1 second. Everyone, let's have a group process in place. Can we all come together, please? Thank you.
Holocaust denial.
Oh, wait. We want to get group process in place. Let's all come together so that everyone can attend, because we want people all the way down there and all the way here to be able to hear you, okay? So occasionally I will just intervene to bring everyone to group process, okay? Great.
So as I said, my fields of research are the Nazi-Arabic cooperation during the World War II, the Nazi propaganda in the Arab world, the Mufti of Jerusalem, Agent Husseini, his war with the Arab, with the Jewish population in the Arab countries, and Holocaust denial in the Arab world. That's it.
My field is comparative literature. I focus on German Jewish thought and culture, and the course I'm working on here is called The Jew's Metaphor, which looks at representations of Jews and Jewishness in 19th, 20th century works of fiction, film, and philosophy.
My main subject is history, especially the history of the Hungarian police in the 19th and 20th century, and also the Gendarmerie, the special police corps in Hungary and in Europe. After that, after finishing the university on that subject, I studied sociology, and nowadays, as I mentioned yesterday, we have a quite new research, quite new science. This is the police science, and I teach at this university, at Faculty of Law Enforcement, at BA, MA, and PhD level. And inside the police science, we have two subjects, or two topics. It's one of them is the hate crimes, crime prevention, and fight against crime, and the other one is the mediation, conflict resolution, and restorative justice. We had a project, a European Union project, together with Austria and Germany, and this was focusing on the minorities, police and minorities. In Hungary, the Roma minority; in Germany, the Turks; and in Austria, the Sub-Saharan Africans. And we finished this project 2015, last January, and after that I worked out this subject, this topic as a subject for our students. I made a syllabus on that topic, mediation and restorative justice, and also on hate crime as well.
Great. That's good.
I'm a historian and a sociologist, and teach a course. I have been teaching courses on the history of the Holocaust, history of at BA and MA levels, and
Okay. Yeah.
My training is in philosophy, more specifically political philosophy. I also have experience working in counterterrorism, and I've published in the field of terrorism studies. I'm interested in liberal democracy and its critics, and I'm currently working on a book with Charles and another colleague on the BDS movement, and also some other projects on one on Raymond Aron and on Tocqueville and Nietzsche, who I've been working on for many years.
My field of research is African Islam, contemporary Islam in Africa, and conflict resolution. For instance, I recently wrote a book about the international intervention in the Darfur crisis, both from the dynamic of local Islam and from international intervention there. And the topic that I want to give with here is about African discourse and perception on the Holocaust from different places in the continent, such as South Africa, Rwanda, Sudan, and Nigeria.
I work as a teacher of Polish course of my research, I used mostly journalism and literature. And I wrote 2 books, and the first one was devoted to anti-Semitic attitudes, prejudices visible in the nationalistic Polish press before the Second War. And the recent book is about anti-Semitic image of Jews visible in popular novels published at the turn of 19th and 20th century. And I also concentrate on the language of hate, so anti-Semitic language, metaphors, image, vocabulary, and so on and so on. So this is the main.
My PhD is in political science, public law, and public administration. I spent the first half of my career writing in Supreme Court voting behavior, U.S. Supreme Court voting behavior. And then I was hired by a school, by a public administration department in my university. So I've leaned in that direction for 15 years now and teach primarily public law and administration, public policy and administration. We started a few years ago a program in emergency management and with policy courses, and got involved in emergency management disaster preparedness policy. And we've done quite a bit of work in that area. It's taken me to Israel 4 times already, working on emergency management issues. And it's an exciting time for me.
Researcher of history of nationalism in Central Eastern Europe, mainly in the Hungarian and Romanian area, and Balkans. And my topics are about national minorities and religious minorities in this area and eastern part of the Mediterranean region and Eurasia.
Hi again, PhD in literature. Chilean author, moved to Colombia, became a Colombianist, working on nationalism, discourse, ideology, and I guess the course that I'm trying to develop, I think, is about anti-Semitism as a form or a manifestation of mimetic desire, which is, where basically the motor of all human history is people wanting what they think other people have got. And anti-Semitism being a sort of growing form of that. So if that's interesting to anyone.
Okay, so my background is in sociology. Speaking about the type of sociology, nobody was actually mentioning these internal discussions in the field. I'm somehow balancing between engaged sociology, although I'm not so much fascinated by Burawa himself, and so to say, interventional sociology. So very often I'm somehow in between sociology and public policy. Speaking about the paradigm which I'm working with is probably structural functionalism. You know how it is with sociologists that even those who think that they are not structurally functional, in fact they are. That this is our kind of illness. Okay, in field of sociology, I'm working on ethnic studies, nationalism, very much migration studies, and within migration studies, integration, accommodation issues. In the past, I've been working a lot on so-called Roma issues, and also on anti-Semitism as a phenomenon in countries practically without Jews these days. And I was writing a lot about anti-Semitism as a way of getting rid of liberal political elite from the political scene. The utilization and usage and abuse, actually how anti-Semitism was abused on the way to get rid of open and liberal society from our countries, and some cases actually successfully. And just not to talk for a very long time, I somehow, thanks to Roma issues, anti-Semitism, ethnic studies of various types, I ended up with writing about social cohesion of modern societies. So I'm somehow continuing ideas of such a thinker as Rainer Bauhoff, so developing his idea about a racist paradox and basically arguing that without structural changes of century-old societies, inclusion of others is illusionary. Simply they have nowhere to integrate to. The core part of society is ethnicized, and actually they cannot penetrate into the core part of society. And I'm developing it based on mostly Roma, but of course of other groups, minority groups. If you know what I'm talking about with racist paradox, racist paradox is the basically description of approach of our societies towards minorities, those who are different, basically asking minorities to get integrated, and when they are doing it, majority is actually, which is based on tribal, blood-based identities that feel actually very much threatened by the process and is increasing demands. So it's a never-ending story. So those people actually have no chances to get integrated, and actually we can see it in Central Europe these days as far as Roma the population is concerned, but of course we saw it in Germany in 20s and 30s with Jews. German Jews were the most integrated, most identified with German culture, German nation. Rabbis of Germany in 20s were worried that actually Jewry is disappearing from Germany precisely because of intermarriages, etc. And we know what happened later. Precisely that led to the borders between us and them, in the case of Germany, were actually disappearing, and that, in the eyes of German nationalists, was threatening the blood-based identity of Germans. And in fact, Germany is...
I'm going to ask you to...
Germany, the last sentence, Germany has been working with it since 1945, at least to a certain extent, but our country is not real, and this is basically what I'm trying to write about.
Okay, so let me just give you a heads up as we wrap up. So I'm going to ask everyone again for a group process as we go through the others. The last few people, don't feel like you have to rush, but just be mindful of time, okay?
I'm sorry.
Okay? No. Let's all come together.
Nobody wants to work with you.
Okay, let's make sure that everyone is focused together. Can we all come together with group process, please? Group process.
I wrote my dissertation on Germany and Poland in the age of Goethe, but that was a long time ago and I was young. And now I live in China, and I teach general courses on almost anything that non-Chinese people do. So from the Chinese western border in Tajikistan all the way around to San Francisco, I would teach it, and it's important for me then to talk about anti-Semitism to a Chinese audience. And one idea occurred to me: maybe it would be a great thing if all of us together, we each had 15 minutes, only 15 minutes, and we stood up and said, "This is how I understand anti-Semitism, and this is the role it plays in world history." When 15 we finish, and the next one. And it leads to a pedagogical question, because my class is only for Chinese students. They only take my class. And many will not have heard of Jews, and maybe not know. And one of the reasons they say all Jews are rich or all Jews are smart is because they don't know anything about them at all. It's important then to decide what you want to teach about it. And I have one teaching program that I'd like to talk to other people about. To me, anti-Semitism is important as a minority experience. It's about being a minority. And this is complicated in China too, because the Chinese word that they use for themselves to describe the majority of people, Han, is how you say Chinese. It's also a word that you can use just to describe a human. So human and majority are basically one thing, and it's hard to understand minority in that context, even if you are one. And also as teacher, the word for teacher in Chinese is literally old master. That's not a Hollywood cliche. So they want you to tell them what a minority experience means. And so this is my goal, to make a class that explains Jewish experience, minority experience, conveys it with authority, yet cultivates the kind of discussion we want.
I am my PhD in cultural anthropology. I was focused on impact of Orthodox Judaism on Israelism. At the time, it's one of my field of interest, Israel studies. And I'm teaching a course first time this year about that. And another field of interest is antisemitism. I've taught courses on contemporary antisemitism in the Czech society within a European framework. And now I'm finishing my postdoctoral project dealing with twisted perspective. And it is like how is it perceived by the members of the Czech Jewish communities, not about the manifestations of antisemitism by itself, but about the perception. So hope I will have some fascinating results.
Okay. Thanks.
I have a PhD in political science. I started off doing work on pressure group influence on foreign policy decision making. I then gradually moved off to doing more work on the nature and behavior of Jews as influencing decision making. Subsequently, I started talking and writing about matters related to the nature of how decision makers are influenced first by the Holocaust, were influenced by the Holocaust, are influenced, and specifically those making foreign policy, and subsequently also looking at issues involving the nature of anti-Semitism as a variable that influences decision makers or doesn't. How foreign service officers and people involved in decision making are affected or not affected by those issues. That all led eventually to my getting involved in an anti-Semitism program that was being created at my university. And for a complicated set of internal university issues, I ended up, and because I had a certain amount of expertise just going in, I was asked if I would get involved in anti-Semitism teaching as part of a master's program which we had on Holocaust and genocide studies. That led to my teaching a course in the history of anti-Semitism after getting some time off to do all the reading I'd never done, although I knew the material, I just didn't go reading. And so what happened is that helped me sort of get another element of focus. And I've done a lot of work in that area, less so on contemporary anti-Semitism, although I've done a considerable amount of reading that I've not taught in that area specifically, and that's really where I'm going to be heading. The other thing I do is my major teaching is in the area of U.S. decision making. It's major U.S. institutions and the nature of how decisions are made. I teach advanced senior seminar in decision making in American politics. And I also do a lot of political consulting work. I'm doing and publishing on contemporary American politics.
My academic background in recent history and politics of Asia is focused on Central and South Asia, including western areas of China, for Soviet space, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India, so I frequently visit these areas and have some knowledge and connections and so on. Besides this, I'm doing research on borderland matters and involved in some project with European Union about borderlands, including security, inter-regional cooperation, and diaspora communities of Asian origin in this area. Right now I am in project on Korean University about Korean community and so on. As for Jewish thematic, I'm associated as a supervisor of several PhD projects about Israel ethno-social problems and Jewish communities in Siberia and Ural area.
So my degree is in Jewish philosophy, which for those people who know, it doesn't actually exist. So what it is actually is an encounter between Judaism and philosophy, Western philosophy. So that sort of informs all my book. I'm always interested in that encounter, and I have great books. So I also did a Socratic, that was one of the I'm sort of between all fields. I'm completely interdisciplinary. Except I don't do the sciences. I know nothing about it. But I'm in a religion department, and I'm between philosophy, literature, and religion itself. Teach courses in Holocaust, so I have, not in this group, but if it were a different group, I'd say I have considerable background. In this group, I'll say I have some background in Holocaust. It's all like, and then I do religion stuff. So I teach a course in Holy War in the 3 Western religions, that sort of thing. That's all I can think of.
I guess my general area of study in recent years is modern Jewish thought, particularly ways in which modern Jewish thinking is shaped by the categories of traditional Jewish texts and teachings. Just a few of the philosophers I turn to are Rosenzweig, Huber, Levinas, Fackenheim. With regard to my syllabus idea, my current idea and what I propose is a course called Explanations of Anti-Semitism, looking at, across disciplines, looking at theological, philosophical, ideological, sociological, psychological, literary attempts to say what is going on and why is it going on. And then ultimately, I would like to address what is going on and why is it going on with anti-Semitism when viewed through the lens and the categories of Jewish thinking. How would the mode of thought that the anti-Semites want to get rid of account for the phenomenon?
Great, and that last, and so just with 1 minute, and then I'll turn it over to Dr. Small, Charles. That is interesting you mentioned theology for the last piece, because these 4 frameworks come specifically from, there's a text called Practical Theology by someone named Richard Osmer, and he uses this format for people just to think about, well, what is going on in the world, and what is the moral thing that ought to be going on with relationship to these problems, right? So that's his prescription. That's interesting that you made that connection. Okay. Just as we prepare, so remember the last bit is that we're going to ask you, not necessarily now, but you can do it now or you can do it by morning. I'm going to ask you, I'm sorry, to group, I thought there were feet there. Just the chairs, okay. To pair up with, ideally, I would suggest 3, but I'm open to discussion if you want 2 or 4, but you don't want it to be too wieldy. And if you just find your team and maybe have a team leader who can at least just or first among equals who will just send me an email saying this is our team, or just have it written up here for us, okay? And so we'll have you can either do that tonight, or we can have you do it by tomorrow. If you want some time to meditate on it, that's fine too. But let's try to aim ideally for like 2 or 3. I would suggest maybe not more than 4 because you really want to be able to engage. But I'm open to discussion on that as well. Just by way of our next steps together, we will meet together on Wednesday night and Thursday night. And in terms of the materials from the professor pack, since one thing to understand is that the curriculum is not a secret, and so in the idea that the curriculum is not a secret, I will tell you that we'll be looking at Forstein and those articles, as well as the discussion on pedagogy from that abstract. Those will comprise the text of our group process discussion. Okay? And then we will have you work in teams, continue to share about your syllabus, and then return again on Thursday, purely syllabus on Thursday. Okay? All right, great. It's been fantastic meeting you and working with you today. I'm looking forward to our next couple of days together. That's long.